Ukraine hosts a trilateral summit with the leaders of Turkey and the United Nations as the conflict continues. Hello, I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy held talks with Turkish President Recep Erdogan and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in Lviv on Thursday. The meeting focused on concerns over the security of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the ongoing shipment of grain from Ukraine, and potential diplomatic solutions to end the current crisis. We begin with this report from CGTN's Sergio Olmos.
Well, at the northeastern end of the country, we heard of explosions, Russian shelling overnight and yesterday. The death toll from that has now risen to 15. One apartment building was destroyed overnight, a dormitory inhabited mostly by elderly pensioners, killing 3 just overnight. Kharkiv has seen shelling since they started the invasion, but Ukraine's second largest city has throughout the entire time seen rocket attacks, missile attacks, and artillery. The death toll from the last 48 hours now climbing to 15. We just talked about the northeast of the country, now to the other end, all the way to the west. UN Secretary General Anton Guterres, Turkish President Erdogan, coming to Ukraine to talk with President Volodymyr Zelenskyy on 2 fronts to discuss the status of the grain deal. President Erdogan saying that, touting the success of the grain deal, saying that 625,000 tons of grain have now moved through the Black Sea as part of this deal. Ukraine has 20 million tons of grain sitting in silos. They are trying to move that out. 25 ships have already departed as part of this deal. They were here to discuss that. They were also here to discuss a much more critical and dire issue, which is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It has been getting shelled all week. I myself saw some of the aftermath on Thursday, smoke rising from the plant. Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, calling it, quote, a suicidal thing for shelling to be occurring at the plant. Backed President Zelensky's call for the area to be demilitarized. President Erdogan saying, quote, we are worried. We do not want another Chernobyl. We heard today from the Russian Defense Ministry, a spokesperson rather, saying that they were declining the appeal for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to be demilitarized, saying that would put the power plant, quote, in a more vulnerable position. We also heard from President Volodymyr Zelenskyy following these high-level talks about the question of whether they brokered some kind of peace deal or a path to peace. President Zelenskyy throwing water on the idea that there would be any peace talks while there were Russian soldiers in Ukraine, saying, quote, negotiations with Russia are possible only if Russian troops leave illegally occupied Ukrainian territory. So some positive results on the grain deal and some dialogue about this issue with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, though it seems like no concrete plans have been made since Russia has declined the appeal for that area to be demilitarized.
Well, to discuss more on this, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Kiev, Ukraine, is Peter Zalmayev. He's the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Out of San Francisco, California, is Recep Becker. He's the Western Regional Coordinator of Act Now to Stop the War and End Racism Coalition. Here in D.C., friend of the show, and Anton Fedyashin. He's the Professor of American History at American University. And also in Kiev is Pavlo Kukhta. He is the former Ukrainian Acting Minister of the Economy. Welcome to you all. Pavlo, I think we'll have to start with you. Obviously, you're right there. Let me just ask you at the top the significance of this visit, both by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and, of course, the Turkish president.
Look, this is an important visit. I wouldn't say it's something groundbreaking. We haven't seen like some kind of deal agreed or something, but these visits are important, and I believe both the situation, the nuclear power plant, and the fact that Mr. Guterres and President Zelenskyy were able to agree on a plan to get UN inspectors there is important for everyone. It's a potential nuclear disaster. Let me just butt in here, because this is the issue of immediate concern. We've seen reports the IAEA may be going in, that there's some sort of diplomatic push, but at the same time conflicting reports about
whether something is about to happen at the plant. Given your vantage point in Kiev, can you first of all say the diplomatic efforts, but also the dangers in the next 24 to 48 hours?
Look, the situation is, I mean, broadly speaking, if we cut out the hysteria, is unchanged. It has been dangerous for the last few weeks already. The Russians are in control of the power plant. They're using it from time to time as a platform for their artillery to fire Ukrainian positions.
Ukrainians are firing back, right? Ukrainians are firing back.
Ukrainians are generally not firing back, according to my knowledge.
Generally, or just not at all, or a bit? I mean, you know, obviously, one missile towards a nuclear power plant is worrying.
Yeah, we don't want a nuclear power plant to be in a crossfire, period. It's dangerous for it to be in such a situation. Moreover, there are problems with personnel access to the facilities. There are problems with maintenance of the facilities. Perhaps this is even more dangerous because the reactors themselves are very heavily protected. That's how they are constructed. But if they are not maintained properly, then anything can happen. Again, this is not a game, right? A nuclear power plant is not a toy. So any kind of possible solution would be great. Again, there are problems with the Russians there because the Russians essentially want to play a game where the inspectors of the UN would come through the territory they control, which would be a deal breaker for Ukraine because that would inadvertently recognize by the UN Russian control over the territories they've occupied.
Well,
so the deal is agreed for them to come through Ukrainian territory as is proper in a sovereign country. And hopefully this deal will be upheld. And the second important thing, very shortly, I'll mention it, is the grain corridor, which Mr. Erdogan talked with Mr. Zelenskyy, which is the main venue for Ukraine to export at least half of its harvest to hundreds of millions of people who will go hungry without it, particularly in Africa and in the Middle East.
Okay.
So it's not a groundbreaking meeting there, but it's an important point, and it's important things that are being discussed.
Well, Pavlo, thank you so much. I actually wanted to widen this out to Peter to have his comments on the grain issue here, but I want to thank you for clarifying what you see as the situation of the nuclear plant. Let's talk to Peter, but first of that, I just want to play a clip from the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy about the significance of this meeting with the UN Secretary General and, of course, the Turkish President.
I want to specifically note the very fruitful talks and active cooperation with the President of the Turkish Republic, Mr. Erdogan. We extensively discussed our bilateral relations, including security, defense, diplomacy, the economy and energy. We focused on the question of reconstruction of Ukraine after the fighting ceases. I thank Turkey for being ready to become a patron of the reconstruction of Kharkiv and the Kharkiv region.
So, Peter, is Turkey in a position here not just to sort of back up this grain agreement, which has seen, as much as 30 ships leave now, and seems to be the only part of a sort of international agreement that can actually stick in Ukraine in the last 6 months. But is this the basis for hope somewhere else? There seem to be sort of slight hints at this.
Well, although Turkey finds itself in a very unique position to, enjoying good relations with both sides in this conflict, with Russia and with Ukraine, it's quite unique. I think Mr. Erdogan is naive if he honestly believes that there can be any breakthrough, simply because Vladimir Putin has not given up on its plans to control all of Ukraine, but he has pretty much run out of steam. The Russian military has been exhausted, and so is probably Putin trying to use Erdogan to force Ukraine against its will, almost, to come to the negotiating table to freeze the current status quo, which means leaving the southern parts of Ukraine in Russia's possession, leaving the nuclear plant in Russia's possession, so that Russia can take a long strategic pause in order to regroup and start attacking Ukraine again down the road, 6 months to a year. This is a very dangerous strategy, and I'm very reassured that the Ukrainian officials are very much aware of this, and so they have said that, we will start negotiating in earnest once we stage a successful counterattack. The simple answer to all these, situations, to the situation with the nuclear power plant, Russia can decide, this matter very quickly and resolve this issue by leaving the territory of Ukraine.
Anton, I want to bring you in here. You're the expert on all this region, and you've just always been so helpful in the past of unpacking the sort of complexities. Let me first of all, though, play you a clip from President Erdogan, because this sort of hints at not just the grain deal, but also Ankara's place going forward.
In our tripartite meeting, we also evaluated the possibilities of transforming the positive atmosphere created by the Istanbul Agreement into permanent peace.
Anton, that's a big leap, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And it tells me that although the issues around the Zaporizhzhia atomic plant and the very positive movement on the grain deal were excuses, or rather, very positive excuses to meet and to sort of drop to the press. I think that behind the scenes, the real issue is that Zelenskyy was reminded that a peace agreement is preferable for all sides. This is not something that he wanted to hear, and I understand him perfectly well. It's something that most Ukrainians don't want to hear. But I'm afraid I have to disagree with Peter. The Russians are not running out of steam. They haven't run out of steam. As a matter of fact, I've been hearing for 5 straight months now how the Russians are running out of everything, including steam. But if you follow even the Ukrainian Armed Services reports, which are daily, if you follow the Institute for the Study of War here in Washington, neither of those is pro-Russian. The map in the east of Ukraine is becoming more and more red, which is the color that most of these places use for Russian-conquered territory. They're moving very slowly, but they're moving methodically, and the Ukrainians are losing territory. We don't know yet what actually happened, what was said behind closed doors, but listen, anyone who follows diplomatic events knows that what's said for the public is one thing, what happens behind closed doors is something else. But everyone is getting tired of this conflict, and I'm afraid that the Ukrainians are coming under increased pressure to start talking to the Russians, although certainly not surrendering or easily ceding territory.
Richard, Becker out in California, can you pick up on this? Because I think Anton raises a good point here, whereas behind the rhetoric, we've essentially got a stalemate, although, everyone declares victory with the recent attacks on Crimea bases, whether they're Ukraine or not, we don't quite know. Incremental advances, as they're called in the West, by Russia in the Donbass region. The potential retaking or keeping of Kherson, I could go on and on. But essentially, is that your view, that essentially Russia is in control here? Or do you see a gap for regional politicians like the president of Turkey to step in and try and deal with the sort of exhaustion that seems to be playing out not just on the battlefield, but also in parts of Western Europe too?
Yeah, and as an anti-war representative of an anti-war organization in the United States, we are hoping above all for an end to the war and for a settlement, a just settlement. I have to say, though, also being from the United States, that we hold the United States government responsible for the prolongation of this war. And not only for the prolongation,
you mean
but
through weapons supplies and financial support?
Yes, very, very large weapons supplies. I mean, I think in Washington, they're very happy about the war. I think they're pleased with the war. They feel like the war, and they're hoping that the war will lead to a weakening of Russia, although I agree with your last guest that I don't think there's any real sign of that at this point. But the fact that the United States, and I think that it wasn't just Zelenskyy and what Zelenskyy wants to do, I think he very much is tied in with what the U.S. policy is and what the U.S. aims are. And in the lead up to the war, the refusal to negotiate in any kind of serious way to Russia was really a fundamental cause of what we're seeing today. And the combination of that and the immense weapon supplies, I think, makes it clear that the U.S. government is willing to fight here to the last Ukrainian.
Yes,
as long as they don't.
Richard, I'm glad you brought that up, fight to the last Ukrainian, but also outside powers may also ask Ukrainians to give up territory they see as their own. I'm not just talking about in the east, but also the whole of Crimea, for example, and that's a difficult ask too, in spite of course, your objection to war.
Well, yeah, I mean, the negotiation has to be between the parties. There's no question about that, or there never will be negotiations. But I think we have to point out that Crimea was not a long-time historical part of Ukraine. And the fact that after the attempted coup backed by the United States, largely organized by the United States in 2014, that led to revulsion on the part of a large part of the Ukrainian population, having seen the neo-Nazis, and not neo, but actual Nazis, lead that coup, that they no longer wish to be a part of a country ruled, given the history of the Soviet Union and Russia and the casualties that it suffered, and as did Ukraine, they did not want to be part of that anymore. So I think the idea that Crimea is going to return to Ukraine, I think that's an illusion.
Well, Richard, we could talk about Crimea, its status within the former Soviet Union, Khrushchev, its Ukrainian roots, etc., etc., etc. But we have the reality now on the ground, and obviously I'd like to go back to Pavlo to respond to what you've just heard about. Essentially, we've got the grain deal, we have the standoff in the nuclear plant, as you talked about, but also this feeling with inflation running high, with Germany facing real problems, with Turkey itself, 80% inflation and reliance on grain and gas from the region. There is starting to be sort of question marks, if not necessarily in public. How is the authorities in Kiev ready to deal with this?
Look, I think we would all welcome the end of the war. Ukrainians, first of all. After all, it's Ukrainian. You know, one thing is to suffer from higher prices, another thing is to be killed.
I think that's an excellent point.
I think you'll agree that it's a different story.
Absolutely.
But, and that is an important point here, besides just Ukrainian interests, this is a very clear war of aggression. It's very one-sided, right? The conflict was clearly started by Russia with very aggressive intentions, with genocidal actions committed throughout. If Russia is somehow rewarded for this, what kind of world shall we see next? What kind of anti-war movement would support rewarding pure wars of aggression?
Pavlo, I totally understand your point here. I totally understand your point. But the trouble is, you know, the League of Nations ideals, the UN ideals don't live up in a war zone. So what I'm trying to say, given the historic nature of the conflict in Ukraine, and the east, in Crimea, the surrounding geopolitical environment, what could Kiev accept? Because obviously we've seen in the last couple of days from the Ukrainian president talking about, well, until all the territories are returned, like Crimea and Donbass, we can't negotiate. That's not generally considered a realistic position, even here behind closed doors in Washington.
We should have to see, again, as I've already said many times on your show, I don't believe we will reach a grand bargain in one step, like some kind of deal that everyone would be okay to take. It would be incremental.
So what's left in the ashes? Is it Minsk 2? Is it Minsk 2? Is it deconflicting? Is it some sort of ceasefire? I mean, you know, 6 months in, people are looking for this sort of answers.
Some sort of cessation of hostilities or downing of hostilities.
Right.
Something else.
A de-escalation spiral.
These are the first realistic steps that can then lead to further negotiations, which would hopefully, ultimately, sometime in the future solve the problem. But at the very least, the first thing is, when you have active hostilities, is to somehow stop them. That is the first thing that can be done here.
Peter, I want to bring you back in. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you think it's more complicated and the view from Moscow is that they incrementally can win this thing?
Well, you know, the view is that, you know, the entire military campaign in Ukraine has been subjected to the will of one person, that is Vladimir Putin. And so the politics of one person overrides any military, you know, considerations.
Right, but the war has been pretty popular in Russia, hasn't it?
There's a debate about that. Vladimir Putin has so far been able to conceal the true costs, including economic, costs and in terms of lives lost from the Russians. He has instituted a veritable, informational gulag. Most Russians do not have access to verifiable and fair information. And so, this is what I referred to earlier.
We can say that about U.S. war in Afghanistan, Vietnam. What I'm saying is look, we can all point fingers. Of course, it's very, very important for people on both sides to have their principles intact. But what I'm asking for is, we've had this grain deal that seems to be succeeding. There may be an IAEA intervention in the nuclear plant. We are starting to see diplomats for the first time, really, try to get a handle on certain aspects of this conflict. Where do you see the potential for a deal here?
I can tell you where I do not see any potential. That's the only thing I can say. And there's no potential. There's no potential in ceding more territory to the Russians. Ukraine must recover all of its territory. Otherwise, it sets a very dangerous precedent for the rest of, for security on the European continent. This sets a precedent for neighboring countries like the Baltic states, Moldova. Vladimir Putin will continue, with his juggernaut, and will present an existential danger to Europe and the rest of the world.
Anton, I want to bring you in here because, I totally understand both people's positions, and I really, obviously, you have to take the point that people suffering from inflation and maybe, having a cold winter is nothing like being shot at. But, if you look at the map of Europe, it hasn't been stable for the last 1,000 years. Things do shift, and there's going to have to be some sort of compromise here. Where do you see it coming from?
I think that given the Ukrainian position at this point on refusing to give up any territory and coming to a peace agreement, it may end up that the Russians and the Americans, as the leaders of NATO, begin to have a broader dialogue about the future of NATO and the future of security in Eurasia and the Atlantic region. This is not to say that the Americans are going to do what they've consistently said they will not, which is to give up Ukrainian territory behind the Ukrainians' backs. But I think that maybe starting from the top, from the broader philosophical questions, may be a way to then come down to the ground and then eventually start dealing with the territorial questions. There's a huge problem with this from the Ukrainian point of view, which I completely understand, which is that with every day that is wasted, the Russians are making gains. The war is not at a stalemate, although I do hear this phrase used regularly in the West. This is not what even Western maps show. The Russians are constantly gaining territory, and they've been doing it without stop after withdrawing from Kiev. That's what makes this situation so poignant and so tragic for the Ukrainians. But there's got to be a way to settle this without sort of rushing into this fairyland of we'll only negotiate after the Russians completely withdraw. If they completely withdraw, what is there going to be to negotiate about? And that's the tragedy, the complexity of the situation.
Anton, I just want you to follow up because I think you're hitting on some important points here. What's the timeline on this? Because denial is not just a river in Egypt, as you seem to be suggesting, but there is a lot of rhetoric that doesn't match reality from Kiev to Brussels to Washington. Yeah. So when does this break? Is it when German grandmas start dying of the cold because their fuel bills are too high? Is it when inflation hits 15% in the UK, going past the Bank of England? You know what I'm saying here. Public opinion matters everywhere. And is that when this starts happening?
I'm afraid that that's what it may have to come down to. And that means that we will have to live with this catastrophe unfolding in Ukraine through this winter, when the situation in Europe, due to this perfect storm that the EU has found itself in the middle of, and partially of its own creation, when this perfect storm comes together and it really begins to devastate the economies of the very countries that have been so vocally and understandably supportive of Ukraine. And that looks inevitable given the figures that are coming out.
We're talking about December, January, February, right?
Yes, and I think maybe by the spring there will be a general public turn away from this and sufficient pressure to push the political will in Europe, in the West, to start talking.
Richard Becker, I want to bring you in here because you're the anti-war party, and it's always good to have people who actually just don't talk about war but actually talk about an alternative. So I'm really pleased you're on. And to you, let's say the war ends tomorrow. Where would you like to see the emphasis of the diplomacy? I mean, for example, Erdogan promised today, which has kind of been lost in the headlines, a reconstruction and infrastructure investment for Ukraine. And even though he's played, obviously his interests with Moscow and Kiev pretty evenly, he has sort of injected some sort of hope of a rebuilding from partners in the region. Is that something you would very much focus on as a confidence-building measure while war is still going on?
I think it's hard to see how that happens, but of course, we want anything, any steps that can be taken to relieve the suffering of the population. I think, though, that in order for there to be real steps forward, there has to be a reconsideration in Washington of this. We're looking at the same group in 2014, essentially some of the same personnel who oversaw the coup then and who refused to negotiate in the lead up to this war and kept saying, we're sure there's going to be an invasion, we're sure there's going to be, well, they were sure because they were sure they weren't going to negotiate.
Okay, but
so going forward, there has to be a recognition of, I think, of Russia's concerns, and particularly in regard to the expansion of NATO, which has been just relentless since the 1990s.
So in a way, even though you're anti-war, and we have I'm not going to criticize Anton, but he's considered pretty beltway at times, you are agreeing essentially of a sort of post-war look at the security architecture for Europe, and that's quite interesting. I'd like to talk about more, but I just want to give the final word to Pavlo. I didn't really talk about this, but what's morale in Ukraine like at the moment? Or does it depend on where you live? I mean, Kiev, Lviv is very distant from the Donbass.
Well, if we're speaking about, let's say, the way people feel, the way people are, whether their morale is breaking, right? I guess that's what you're asking. Because of course, no one likes to be in a war. It's an unpleasant experience, let me tell you that. Yeah. But otherwise, the people in the polls clearly show that they're generally, they want the country to resist. They are supportive of the military and the government in the war effort. They are not breaking down. They are not in panic. They are not in any kind of defeatist move.
Okay, well, thanks so much.
In that sense, Ukrainian population is quite resilient.
Well, it's worth thinking on. Pavlo, Peter, I know you want to speak something, but we'll get you next time. Anton, Richard, thank you so much for joining us. I think it was a really good discussion. We went beyond the headlines and really thought about the future here, no matter how grim the choice is. And we need to leave it there. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching another edition of The Heat. See you soon.